Hi, Jeremy Cordeaux in the Court of Public Opinion. I'm just on air here to let you know that we'll be live streaming the Court of Public Opinion every Friday between 9 o'clock and 12 on jeremycordeaux.com. Please join us. We'd love to have you.
Dr. Travis Brown, what is This Medical Life all about?
This is the pursuit of knowledge as we learn about diseases from the ancient times to the present day. These are the stories of medicine.
Dr. Travis Brown, at the time of recording this, I'm 24 hours away from my flu shot for the winter of 2023. Am I going to discover that I'm doing the right thing?
I think you already know you are doing the right thing. So we are looking at influenza. It is influenza season. And look, I can't think of a more appropriate time to be talking about this, because it was interesting. I was reflecting on my time coming here, and there's a real thing called the sort of pandemic fatigue. And people, we've just been through COVID, and people are just exhausted from COVID, and it's still going on. And I realized how much of a kind of almost a modern concept that must be. Just because we've been through one pandemic doesn't mean we can't have another one. Mm-hmm. And you realize when you actually look in history that when we hear about pandemics and epidemics with our ancestors, it must be just because this was so bad that it made the history books. But diseases were always circulating. They always had either influenza or cholera or plague just going along in the background. They didn't have ways to protect themselves like we do. And so when you hear about it, there must have been a low-level acceptance of disease that was just prevalent. And then you get these massive spikes that makes the history books. And when I was looking at influenza, it comes from Latin. It means to flow into. And in the Middle Ages, they thought there was intangible fluid that came from the stars, and that this affected humans. And so influenza was any disease outbreak that they thought was influenced by the stars.
And I thought today's conspiracy theorists were the nutbags.
Well, and this was the thing. When in 1743, there was an influenza outbreak, an epidemic in Italy, and it was called Influenza di Catarrh, which interpreted as epidemic of catarrh, which means excessive discharge or buildup of mucus. And so this spread across Europe, and what ended up happening was the name influenza in English just was shortened down. And so this is how we get influenza. Now, there's 4 types of influenza, A, B, C, and D, and A and B are the ones that are the seasonal epidemic ones that we're used to. And looking at it, type A, just going through a quick revision, you look at it, type A is actually classified by 2 viral proteins, hemagglutinin and neuraminidase, and we shorten that to H and N. And so you'll see there's 18 different subtypes of H and there's 11 subtypes of N, and that's how we classify it. You'll hear H1N1, H5N2,
yes.
And that's because we look at the viral proteins and we can tell, and we can sort of classify it that way. It gives us something to look at what the influenza and classify it. And we often refer to the 1918 influenza pandemic. Now, people call this the Spanish flu, even though it started in the US in the army barracks, and this is a sort of a propaganda type discussion that we'll leave for another time. But this was estimated to kill or infect about a third of the entire world. They were estimated about 500 million people. And it killed anywhere between 50 and 100 million people in just over 15 months. And all ages were affected. This is predominantly the ones who actually affected was less than 5, greater than 65. But the unusual part was 20 to 40-year-olds, healthy. And people died of this. And so this was such a shocking disease that it continues to make our history books, and rightly so. There is a quote, and when I was looking at this going, we'll pull out the story of this. And there is a quote from Joseph Stalin. It says, one death is a tragedy, a million is a statistic, And this really falls into that because it's like it's really easy to say, 50 million people died, and not to really have any grasp of what that means. And so I wanted to put a bit of a personal sort of bent on this episode. And there is things, because of the 1918 influenza, there is letters and journals of people from 1918 who experienced the pandemic. And this is everything from, much like what we've experienced, someone's experience of COVID can be completely different from in the same city to your neighbor. Someone can be mildly inconvenienced to have family members who have died.
Or missed it altogether as well.
That's right. And so I wanted to sort of take just a few of these little stories, these little just excerpts, to see, well, what was it like for them? And the first is Violet Harris, who's a 15-year-old in Seattle when the pandemic hit.
It was announced in the papers tonight that all churches, shows and schools would be closed until further notice to prevent Spanish influenza from spreading. Good idea? I'll say it is. So will every other school kid, I calculate. The only cloud in my sky is that the school board will add the missed days onto the end of the term.
And so her writings would dawn eventually this realization that this is quite a bad illness to be hitting her town. One of her friends becomes so ill that she can barely walk, and she asks her friend, "What's it like?" And her friend just replies, "Don't get it." And it was interesting because all public gatherings were banned for 6 weeks. And masks, and then the restrictions were lifted after that, and she was quite jubilant about all of that. But if you can imagine a 6-week ban, it's not going to do anything to that pandemic going on. But that was her initial experience, and that was just a bit of a, people had that with COVID as well. But then we moved to Dorman Kent, and he's a historian and businessman in Vermont, and he became ill with the flu.
Awoke at 7 a.m. Sick, sick, sick. Didn't try to get up or try to. Had a high fever for an awful headache every minute all day, and was sick to my stomach also. Tried to get Dr. Watson in the morning, but he couldn't come. Told us instead what to do. Greased cloths with an inflammacine all day and put around throat and chest, and held a bottle of hot water at throat most of the time. Took a Seidlitz powder about 10 a.m. and threw it up soon, so then took 2 tablespoons of castor oil. Then the movements began, and I spent a good part of the time at the seat. There is a tremendous lot of influenza in town.
And so if we move to Edith Mahoney, now she's married and a socialite in the state of Massachusetts. And she kept a 3-line-a-day diary, just regularly. And this was about socializing and shopping in her life. And we come to September in 1918, and the entries change to focus on the epidemic.
Fair and cold today. Pa and Frank here to dinner, just back from Jefferson Highlands. Rob, Edith's husband, played golf with Dr. Ferguson and Mr. Warren. Eugene F. went to the hospital Friday with Spanish influenza. 1,500 cases in Salem. Bradstreet Parker died of it yesterday, 21 years old.
Now, 4 days later, who she referred to as Eugene, died from the flu.
Several thousand cases in the city with a great shortage of nurses and doctors. Theatres, churches, gatherings of every kind stopped. Rob was to be one of Eugene's pallbearers, but became sick himself. He was in bed all day with high fever, bound-up head and aching eyeballs. The following day, Rob, very much better. He has a husky throat. James Tierney died, 37 years old. Doctors say there is no sign of the epidemic abating.
And so if we turn our attention now to the entries of doctors, we have physician Franklin Martin, who, this staggers me a little bit, who became ill during his post-war tour of Europe. So,
oh, gee.
So he's in the World War I, and then after that decides to go around Europe in one of the world's worst pandemics, but that's what it is. But he has some writings.
About 12 o'clock I began to feel hot. I was so feverish I was afraid I would ignite the clothing. I had a cough that tore my very innards out when I could not suppress it. It was dark. I surely had pneumonia, and I never was so forlorn and uncomfortable in my life. Then I found that I was breaking into a deluge of perspiration, and while I should have been more comfortable, I was more miserable than ever.
So that brings us to physician N. Roy Grist, and he's a doctor who is in a hospital looking after the patients with influenza.
These men start with what appears to be an attack of la grippe or influenza, and when brought to the hospital, they very rapidly develop the most viscous type of pneumonia that has ever been seen. 2 hours after admission, they have the mahogany spots over their cheekbones, and a few hours later, you can begin to see the cyanosis extending from their ears and spreading all over the face until it is hard to distinguish the coloured men from the white. It is only a matter of a few hours then until death comes, and it is simply a struggle for air until they suffocate. It is horrible. One can stand it to see 1, 2, or 20 men die, but to see these poor devils dropping like flies sort of gets on your nerves.
Now, Grist wrote that an average of 100 patients died each day. But if there's ever a quote that I think will resonate with our audience and reach back 100 years ago and feel someone's isolation and despair, I think this next one is that.
It's more comfortable when one has a friend about. I want to find some fellow who will not talk shop, but there ain't none, nohow. We eat it, sleep it, and dream it, to say nothing of breathing it 16 hours a day. I would be very grateful indeed if you would drop me a line or two once in a while, and I promise you that if you ever get into a fix like this, I will do the same for you. Associate Professor Paul Griffin is the Director of Infectious Diseases at Mater Health Services in Brisbane and Associate Professor of Medicine at the University of Queensland School of Medicine. He has fellowships in infectious diseases from the Royal Australasian College of Physicians, in clinical microbiology from the Royal College of Pathologists of Australasia, and from the Australasian College of Tropical Medicine. Paul's involved in research in early and late phase trials, including over 125 clinical trials, predominantly in infectious diseases, and maintains an active interest in clinical and diagnostic microbiology. He's currently the coordinating principal investigator for a universal influenza vaccine with Mater researchers in Brisbane. And Associate Professor Paul Griffin is our guest today on this Medical Life podcast. Welcome, Paul.
Thanks very much for having me.
As I mentioned at the top of our show, very timely, because in 24 hours I'm having my influenza shot for this year, so I'm wanting to soak up all the goodness from our conversation today. But I'd like to start with the fact that we always hear about the warnings of influenza every approaching winter. Just how dangerous is it?
Look, I think it's a really important point and one that a lot of people underappreciate, and especially with our intense focus appropriately on COVID for a period of time, I think people have lost sight of the significance and the potential severity of influenza. And so typically in a normal year, we might have what we'd call an attack rate, so a proportion of people infected of, say, 5 to 10%. That can be as high as 30% in certain years. And then in terms of severe disease, sometimes we lose in the vicinity of 1,000 or even up to 5,000 Australians in a single year from influenza. Usually it's a bit less than that, of course, but can be as high as that. And the flu can result in nearly 20,000 hospitalisations in a year that's maybe a little bit worse than usual. Hundreds of thousands of doctor visits, so our GPs get inundated with people with influenza. And lost work days can be 1.5 million, for example, in a bad year. So if we add up both the severe cases, but also the amount of impact in terms of people being able to fulfil their normal function and turn up to work, the flu has a really enormous impact, actually. And that's really why it's so important for people to get vaccinated.
Now, we have mentioned in the first segment about hemagglutinin and neuraminidase. And can you tell us what subtypes are we most concerned about?
Look, it's interesting. We're concerned about quite a few at the moment. I mean, if we look at the flu that's circulating in quite high numbers for this time of year in our country, that's an influenza A, and we haven't typed a lot of them yet, but the majority that we have are H1N1. So if you look at our current season and what we're seeing, H1N1 is probably what we're most concerned about in that context. But then if we look at the new or emerging or concerning flu strains that are out there, there's a few, and probably the most concerning would be H5N1, and that's traditionally been a bird flu. And in recent years, there's been tens of millions of birds that have been impacted by that, lots of culling of birds, unfortunately. But increasingly, we're seeing the ability of that strain to infect mammals and a variety of species, and has caused a small number of human cases. Doesn't appear to be good at being transmitted from person to person yet. But I guess that's one property we're concerned about, is this is what flu can do. It can change and gain these properties that cause problems. But as recently as the last few days, a H5N5 flu strain has also been found to be able to infect mammals increasingly. So that one is also of a bit of concern at the moment.
Now, we have mentioned the 1918 pandemic, so that H1N1 sort of raised my eyebrows a little bit. Do we know why that strain, or potentially even the one we've been mentioning, was so dangerous?
I think there's lots of elements to that. There were lots of things going on at the time, a lot of people moving around. So, and some of these are well established. Some of these are just my theories, I guess. But a lot of people moving around, perhaps more than ever before, with people being transported for the war. So I think that contributed to spread. I think it was a new pandemic strain. So there wasn't a lot of protection in the population at that time as well. And obviously back then we didn't have the sort of treatments we have now. We've obviously got excellent antibiotics to treat secondary bacterial infections. We've got excellent antivirals and really good supportive care as well, all of which didn't exist back at that time. And I think also with some of the changes due to the wartime, people were perhaps living in different situations, maybe more crowded environments, more time indoors, for example. And I think the healthcare capacity, as primitive as it may have been at that time, was even further decimated by a lot of people being involved in the wartime effort as well. So I think there's those sort of factors, but also it was a nasty virus in itself. And some studies from lungs from people back then showed that it was able to replicate at high levels, found in high levels in the lungs. So even notwithstanding all those external circumstances, was a pretty nasty flu strain in its own right.
As an observer who's not in the medical profession, it seems to me those factors you talked about, lots of troop movements, a new virus, that's kind of COVID-19. New virus, novel virus, and we jet set everywhere. So we've got the replicant of that movement.
Yeah, look, it's a really good point. I mean, a lot of people have asked, we've obviously seen COVID, and it's kind of, I think that one of the buzzwords was unprecedented, but then we've seen other things emerge like monkeypox, for example. And so a lot of people have been asking, why are we seeing more emerging infectious diseases? And I think the fact that the world is a smaller place than ever before, with people being able to travel more readily, but also things being able to be sent around the world more readily than ever, has contributed to that. But then there's things like climate change probably has an impact on some of these infections, as well as the change of habitat of a lot of animal reservoirs. We're destroying forests. And so some of these animals that previously resided a long way away from humans are now potentially interacting more and more. And so there's a host of factors, but absolutely the fact that people travel around means that if we see a new emerging pathogen in one part of the world, it's really everywhere within a small number of days.
Now, there's some key words with influenza that I wanted to raise with you. There's shift and drift. Can you tell us the difference and the significance of these terms?
Yeah, look, this really underpins why the flu is such a concerning virus and why it's such a challenge for us to combat. So we know when viruses replicate, they can make mistakes, and that leads to subtle or significant changes in the virus. And with the flu, it's a little bit prone to making some of those mistakes. So when it makes a mistake that causes a few little changes, we call that a drift. And usually that means it doesn't change type. It'll still be the same H1N1, for example, but it'll be a little bit different. And that means immunity, both from past exposure, but also vaccination, may not protect quite as well. And one of the reasons, of course, why our flu vaccine is updated every year. And then we can see a much more significant change, a shift. And that's where, the flu is comprised of 8 different bits of RNA, basically. And if 2 flu strains infect the same, usually it's an animal, something like a pig, for example, it can basically randomly package up new parts. And that's how a H1N1 might turn into a H1N5, for example. And so that's a really significant change, meaning that our protection, both from past exposure and vaccination, is even less effective. And basically, it means the whole world could be considered vulnerable to that strain. And of course, the last time that happened on that sort of a scale was 2009 with H1N1, the swine flu, where we had that sort of an event in pigs, hence the name, and that meant nobody had any recent protection from that virus, and it caused obviously huge problems worldwide.
Now, we often focus on influenza A, but why is influenza B almost sort of just tagged on at the end as sort of an addendum or an afterthought? Can you tell us why?
Yeah, look, they are quite different. I mean, we know the flu A is the one that typically causes more severe disease. It typically has the ability to change more quickly. So those factors of particularly drift are a little more relevant, and it means that with those changes, our vaccines may not provide that same level of protection, for example. So it is the one that is typically more prevalent and causes more severe disease, which is why we talk about it. But the unfortunate reality, and this has been highlighted on the other side of the world this year, a really big, large flu A peak at the start of the season, then a late peak of flu B. So it's not one that should be dismissed by any means.
Now, is there any way to predict how severe an annual seasonal influenza is going to be?
The simple answer there is no, not reliably. And, I think it's a little bit like predicting the weather. We have great tools that we use to do that. We have, excellent scientists, researchers who do that, but you can't predict it accurately all the time. And so, we pay close attention to what's happening all across the world. And, often what happens in the other hemisphere does predict to a degree what's likely to happen in our hemisphere. But then you need to factor in things like vaccine uptake, vaccine match, etc. So there's a whole host of factors that really play into that. So while we're able to have, what I think is a really well-educated guess, it's impossible to know with any certainty.
Are there certain people in the population who should be paying closer attention to these predictions and utterances, etc., who might be at greater risk of infection?
Yeah, look, there are certain groups that traditionally are at significant risk with the flu. And I think this is an important point this year in particular, because it's not the same groups necessarily as COVID. And so, one of the biggest differences is the impact of the flu on children. And, the highest rate of notifications, highest rate of hospitalizations typically occurs in the younger part of our population. So, at the moment, 40% of our cases have been recorded in children 14 years and under. And that does mean that certainly in our young kids, there are kids that are getting sick with this virus and ending up in hospital. And, importantly, kids contribute very significantly to the spread as well. Then we know age is a risk factor for more severe disease. That's, I guess, similar to COVID in some ways. And then there are a host of medical problems that also mean people are at greater risk. And they're people who are immune suppressed, either through treatment for something like an autoimmune or a malignant condition, diabetes, lung disease, for example, people in residential aged care. And, there's a story there that we'll all be familiar with how severely impacted that area of our population has been with COVID. It's similar with the flu, prone to outbreaks. So, yeah, there are lots of parts of our population that are at an additional risk, I guess, for the flu. And, we're very lucky that our flu vaccine recommendations, it's recommended for everyone each and every year, 6 months of age and older. But because of that risk profile, certain groups are funded, and that includes children 6 months to 5 years, adults 65 years and over. And a lot of those at-risk populations, including people with some of those medical problems I mentioned, can also get a vaccine funded by the National Immunisation Program.
Now, you mentioned earlier we have ability for antivirals with influenza. Can you tell us how effective, how useful are these medications?
It's interesting because there's been quite a bit of debate about this. And, as we've seen, again, without drawing too many references to COVID, with some COVID interventions, a Cochrane review was quite divisive in terms of the impact of these medications. And there was a large Cochrane review of our most commonly used influenza antiviral neuraminidase inhibitors that suggested perhaps there wasn't a demonstrable impact from those medications. But I think there were some challenges with that study. It looked at a range of different outcomes. It looked at people with flu flu-like illness is not necessarily flu, absolutely. And so I'm confident these medications make a difference. And the way they work is as a neuraminidase inhibitor. That's the bit that basically helps to free the virus. And so it prevents the release of new virus from the host cell and basically stops it spreading and infecting neighbouring cells. But one of the biggest determinants of how well these work, and in fact, this goes for nearly all antivirals, to be honest, is how quickly it's initiated. So, some would say that after 72 hours, the impact of this sort of a medication is minimal. In the highest risk parts of our population, so people that are pregnant or unwell, we would still initiate it after that time. But that's why we need people to be aware the flu is around, that we have these medications and how to access them. So, that's why I think things like early testing when you have a significant flu-like illness and you're someone who's vulnerable is really important. And in terms of the impact, many would say it shortens the duration of illness by at least a few days, shortens or reduces the prospect for progressing to more severe disease. And so that potentially can contribute to, obviously keeping people out of hospital, which is really important, and stopping people succumbing from this virus.
So with a general practitioner, so the practical advice, though, is if someone comes in with influenza-like symptoms, would you wait to test, or would you actually prescribe the medication and then sort of confirm with testing? How would you go about that practically?
Obviously there are individual circumstances that may be relevant here, so it's not prevailing advice for every single case, but typically we would want people to be tested, especially, at the moment where we have influenza and COVID as well as RSV, for example. And so the other part of this is that, typically for most practitioners, there is fairly ready access to testing. And, we are getting rapid antigen tests that will cover the flu and COVID and RSV, and they'll become more prevalent soon. And for many, laboratory PCR-based testing should still be fairly readily available. Obviously, if you've got a really high-risk patient with very consistent signs and symptoms, it's at a time where there's high levels of transmission of the flu and you can't get access to testing, then empiric treatment may be something that's appropriate. And certain parts of our population, like some of those we've mentioned that are the highest risk, including pregnant women and people who are severely immunocompromised, they may be people you'd consider if you're in that circumstance in particular. But, hopefully these days we can get a test quickly, we can know whether it's flu, COVID or another virus, and then initiate appropriate treatment as quickly as possible.
Let's pause briefly as we shift gear from treatment to prevention, and back in a moment to go deeper into the realm of influenza vaccine. We're continuing our discussion with Associate Professor Paul Griffin regarding our deep dive into influenza in this episode. Paul, in the traditional vaccination recommendations, patients are often recommended to have an influenza shot each year. How's the strain of these vaccines determined on an annual basis?
Yeah, a lot of really good work goes into trying to predict what strains will be circulating, and most of the time it's accurate. There's a good match with what's in the vaccine and what we see circulating. And so what we do is we have an expert group that meets a few times a year, but usually that decision's made in around October. They look at what's happened in the other hemisphere, what strains have been circulating. They look at what happened in our preceding season. They look at access to strains of flu that they'd like to put in the virus, and how people responded to the vaccine as well. And so all of that information goes into combining the most likely strains into a vaccine. And, we're fortunate these days that our vaccine includes 4 different strains. So we don't just have to try and pick the one we think is most likely. And that covers us for 2 flu A strains and 2 flu B strains. And, since we've had those quadrivalent or those vaccines, including those 4 bits, we've actually done pretty well at having a pretty good match every year.
Are we able to measure how effective the vaccine is from year to year, or it's just a best guess type arrangement?
There are some really good studies done every year to try and calculate the effectiveness of that vaccine. I think that's really useful for us to monitor how we've gone with some of those decisions and see where we may need to improve. And the effectiveness typically is calculated somewhere between about 30 and 60%. So, not the lofty heights of what we saw with our COVID vaccines initially, but still an excellent level of effectiveness, a vaccine that makes a huge difference every year.
Now, there is a very vocal segment, anti-vaccination parts, and even vaccine hesitancy against having injections, just in general, in influenza. Is there any advice, or what do you say to people who will be hesitant to get an influenza vaccine?
I think the main thing is to be informed, and now more than ever, there's still so much misinformation, and there's a lot of misinformation about flu vaccines as well. So I just encourage people to be informed, to get their information from reputable sources, to have a discussion with their GP or pharmacist, who have done a fantastic job, of course, of really stepping up for the rollout of the COVID vaccines, but have always done a great job of flu vaccination, and getting your information from those sources, having a discussion that can be tailored to your situation and address some of your specific concerns. I think the majority of people who are labelled as hesitant just need to have the right sort of information and that the ability to have that discussion. And some of the misinformation we still see circulate is that the vaccine gave me the flu, and of course we know it can't do that. There's absolutely no live virus in that vaccine, and there's a few explanations for that. Mild adverse events from the vaccine can include things like a fever that people can mistake for an infection. But there are other viruses circulating at the time when we give these vaccines out, things like RSV, common cold viruses, so it can be one of those. A lot of people say, well, it didn't stop me getting infected, so what's the point? But it reduces the chance of you getting infected and greatly reduces your chance of severe disease. So that's one that we need to stamp out. And then a lot of people also say the flu's not that bad, and that's because they might have had a cold last year and that wasn't too bad. But we know the flu can and does put a lot of people in hospital and make a lot of people unwell, and people don't survive that. So there's definitely a justification on severity. And then there's a host of other things. But, I think just having that discussion, being informed, there's some people who just won't have one, and that's okay. But, hopefully we can give people that information to help encourage at least a few of those people who were previously hesitant to get the vaccine.
Now, we've been talking about the traditional vaccine, get your shot every year, but you're involved in a different type of influenza vaccine. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I mean, the fact that we're pursuing improved vaccines for these sort of infections, including the flu, in no way diminishes the benefit of our current vaccine, which is, makes a tremendous impact each and every year. But there are some limitations, and having to update it every year, having to worry about a new emerging flu strain that isn't currently included, causing a new pandemic, for example, is a good reason to pursue what we usually describe as a universal flu vaccine. So one that doesn't need to be tailored to the different strains. We don't need to worry about which H and N is circulating at the time. And one of the ways we can do that is to target something on the virus that doesn't change. And there are some components on the surface or just below some of these other proteins that don't change. And one of those is a thing called a nuclear protein. And so that's what this vaccine targets. And people have tried this before, but often it's hard to get a strong enough response because, the bits that are on the surface are easier for our immune system to target and a more effective way of that vaccine working. But this vaccine also includes some really clever ways of getting a better response against that nuclear protein. And the way it does that is it's these small particles that assemble in a specific way that not only stimulates our B cells to make antibodies, which is really the focus of traditional flu vaccines, but also gets a lot of help from our T cells, which help to really improve that response and address some of the issues with getting a strong enough response against that more conserved part of the virus. So the early studies of this vaccine look really good, and we're really happy to be helping progress it through clinical trials.
So I've read a part about this was something called OVX836. What is this and how important is it?
Yeah, so the OVX836, that's the universal flu vaccine that we're trialling. That's the one that targets the nuclear protein and does so in a really clever way using these small particles that assemble in the right way to get really good responses from both B and T cells. And it's a vaccine that's been through, I think it's 6 or 7 other clinical trials already in various stages. And so we're doing a bigger phase 2 study, really looking at how that works in the field to a higher degree, and also looking at combining it with the traditional flu vaccine, because there's some suggestions from early studies there might be a bit of a synergistic effect from targeting this new, more conserved part and adding in the vaccines that target the traditional parts of the virus. So maybe the combination might actually be where we end up.
Will this cover both influenza A and B, or is this just more A?
It targets both. So far in the studies in animals, it looks to cover basically every known flu strain so far. So, that's an amazing achievement, a really promising property for a vaccine to have. So, yeah, really looking forward to the results of these trials.
Now, how many people are involved in this trial at the moment?
So this current trial, we're looking for 600 people across the country. As I said, there's been quite a few other trials of this vaccine already. So, the numbers are growing quite a lot in terms of the data that we have. But this trial in particular, which is really focusing on also the combination with current existing flu vaccines, is looking for around 600 volunteers across the country.
Now, do you have any sort of estimation or expectations as to how long this vaccine will cover a patient for?
Look, it's hard to know. There's been some really promising early data to suggest it might be quite some time. We haven't really got human data yet on the combination with the existing flu vaccine. That's what we'll get from this trial, but it may be quite some years. So, maybe the prospect of having to get a vaccine each and every year might be something that we don't necessarily have to continue doing if we get something like a universal vaccine like this off the ground.
And then you mentioned that you're aiming to get 600. Are you recruiting at the moment for people to actually to get involved in this trial?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're still recruiting for this trial at the moment. There's around 8 sites across the country. And so if people are looking to participate, I'd certainly encourage you to have a look on the internet for the Aussie Vax or the Universal Flu Vaccine Study. Those sort of terms should find a local site. And, we know these sort of vaccine candidates are really exciting. It's got some great properties, but the simple fact is without healthy volunteers for our clinical trials, we can't progress exciting technology like this. So, I've been in clinical trials for a long time and, really value each and every volunteer that comes along to participate because it not only helps, that study, but really helps us advance some exciting candidates, particularly vaccines like this.
Paul, is there any final advice or last thoughts you have for GPs about influenza?
Yeah, look, I think this is going to be perhaps one of the most challenging influenza years we've seen in a very long time. I think there's a lot of new challenges in terms of people's expectations for information on vaccines. There's a lot of misinformation circulating about all vaccines at the moment. I think some fatigue and frustration at having to have gone through what we've dealt with COVID that's now spilling over a little bit to talking about another infection in influenza. So I think it is going to be a really challenging year, and the numbers are already escalating to levels that are on a similar trajectory to 2019. So I think it's going to be a big year. And it's going to be a big flu year with COVID still having to be contended with also. So I think the simple advice is to try and help as many patients as possible, be prepared. And I think, right now the focus is very much on vaccination as it should be. And we need to get as many people vaccinated as possible. There are more options for flu vaccines than we've had for a while too. So understand those options and discuss those with your patients. But then also I think being prepared for particularly our most vulnerable patients and how they'll manage if or when they get a flu-like illness, how to get a test quickly. That's harder than it's been for a while. A lot of people are frustrated at access to testing, so helping them know how to get a test quickly and how to access antivirals quickly. And, Tamiflu or the neuraminidase inhibitors for influenza do make a big difference, particularly if started early. So I think having a plan in advance for our most vulnerable patients about how to get access to that so they can get the most benefit is also going to be a really big part of what we do this year. And also the other thing, of course, which is what the GPs are doing each and every day, is trying to optimise some of those medical problems that do create that risk and potentially doing that ahead of time. Things like optimising chronic lung conditions, for example, so they're as well managed as possible and those patients are prepared for what might be in store for this season.
Well, you've certainly buoyed my confidence. I'm going ahead and confirming my shots tomorrow for both flu and my COVID booster. Paul Griffin, thank you so much for joining This Medical Life.
Been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
This Medical Life is recorded in the Talked About Marketing Studios in Adelaide. For show notes and more information about the podcast, visit thismedicallife.com.au. You can contact the hosts via Twitter. Dr. Travis Brown is at Dr. Travis Brown. That's DR for doctor. And Steve Davis is at Steve Davis. Editing and production is by Tim Whiffen. Design is by Tom Buzenshut. This has been a Pathnotes Proprietary Limited production.
Hi, Jeremy Cordeaux in the Court of Public Opinion. I'm just on air here to let you know that we'll be live streaming the Court of Public Opinion every Friday between 9 o'clock and 12 on jeremycordeaux.com. Please join us. We'd love to have you.